Then we also look at what I call food safety in inverted commas, because it's not directly as part of the food safety as defined under the World Trade Organization agreement. But in terms of this context, it does result in a reduction of risk to human health. So the first one we have is the sodium reduction regulations, which has a phased-in approach. I think they were published in 2012. The first levels took effect in 2016, and the second levels take effect now in 2019. This is trying to look at foods that have high sodium content, that companies must then reduce it to an acceptable level. And there's 13 categories of food. One of them is bread, the other one is the processed meats, just as for information. Then remember, we spoke about undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. So we fortify the staple foods, somebody has mentioned that as well, with 6 micronutrients. These are under review to comply with the WHO revised guidelines. We also iodate salt. We want to reduce reduce how much salt you eat, but we iodate it. Okay? But it's the only vehicle that allows the best way to get the iodine in. Okay? Then we also have food composition issues covered in the Foods for Infants, Children and Young Children. And in process at the moment is what we call dietetic products, foods for special medical purposes. When you're sick in hospital and you can't eat, or you have a specific disease condition, renal failure, etc., there are foods that you need to eat there or drink. And then on the horizon is the foods for special dietary use. It's an area that was not finalized owing to the Medicines Act taking some aspect of health supplements in relation to complementary medicine, some of the stuff that was covered by the prof from MRC in relation to some of the traditional medicines. Ayurvedic is one of the disciplines, I think, in the schedules for complementary medicines. So now that there's been a distinction as to what the Act 101 was dealing with, we can now look at the foods for special dietary uses. Food labeling, that's the benefit for human health, where we have regulatory nutrition. We have labeling regulations in place since 1977, revised in 1993, 2010 again, and now we're updating it again, to allow for manufacturers to put claims as well as nutrient profiling, front of pack labeling and marketing to children. This is where we're now trying to make the label much more easier to understand, because not many people understand the label. This nutritional table is a South African version. Who actually goes and look at that table? Some dietitians don't even know how to read it. So recently there was a public health promotion launch by Healer that's called Do You Know What's in Your Food, or What's in Your Food? I don't know if any of you heard about it. It was launched, I think, on the 20th of February, yes. So you hear these flightings on the media, but when this was launched, the department was also part of it, because we're working with Healer to deal with some of the health promotion activities. And some of the comments was that we are now becoming a nanny state. All we want to do is say there are certain foodstuffs that shouldn't be marketed to children, because children at that place in life, their decisions on how they're going to turn out as adults are based. So if you're influencing them at that age to drink Coca-Cola, that's how they're going to take off later on. But if you influence them to have healthier choices, we might reduce the spiraling diseases of lifestyle. So that's why a lot of countries have adopted this. The Chileans have been the first ones to look at it. It's what we call negative front of pack labeling, where we put in a product that should not be marketed to children, having a logo. But we're still doing the science around it. Is it acceptable in the country? How do people perceive logos? How many of you have seen a heart logo on food? Cancer, the cancer one? Okay. The GI one? 5 a day? Yeah. Do you know what we discovered with some of the consumer research with the cancer one? Now, okay, let me first explain. Those logos are put on food by endorsing entities with the permission of the Department of Health. Okay, so the Heart and Stroke Foundation can put the Heart Healthy logo on certain products after they've gotten the approval. Cancer can do the same thing. 5-A-Day can do the same thing. Some consumers perceive the cancer logo to mean, if I eat that food, I'm going to get cancer. Whereas it's the direct opposite. Eat more of that to avoid cancer, because it's high in antioxidants and those kinds of things. So that's why it's always important for us to adapt to something to the local context. We don't just take something from somewhere else and now want to implement it, which is a lot of how government has done policy in the past. Then under the Health Act, there are certain issues under nutrition that they would like to regulate and can't be done under our Foodstuffs Act. So there's one regulation they're working on called milk banks. What do you think those are? Breast milk, yes, express breast milk. So mothers who can't breastfeed can then go in and get some samples of milk or supplies of milk for their own babies. Okay? They're called milk banks. I don't know if they're going to have a problem from the Reserve Bank that you cannot call it a milk bank. No, I'm dead serious. The supplier is. Who else? Where do you get express breast milk from? Why do you think it couldn't become a foodstuff? It's not ordinarily eaten or drunk by all humans. So that's why we couldn't put it under the Foodstuffs Act. Okay? So the joke about the banks, remember we also have a problem of food waste. So we're adopting the US approach, and there's an NGO that created the similar type of thing called food banking, where people can donate expired foodstuffs. Expired, I'm not going into it today. No time, hey, chairperson. But they can donate that food in the US to a food bank. So they tried to have the same name in South Africa, and they were told by the Reserve Bank they can't use it as the bank name because only financial institutions can have the word bank. So let's see if they pick up on that one. Then there are also norms and standards for nutrition. So the Health Act allows for setting norms and standards for nutrition as well. Then we have the World Health Organization's International Health Regulations of 2005, and this is what obligates countries to report any food safety issue of international concern where food has been internationally traded. So this is what we had to do when we found what the culprit food was that caused the listeriosis outbreak. Okay, we had to immediately, in fact, when the outbreak started, we notified and continued to update them on what the progress was, and then when we eventually found the source. So other regulatory or legislative measures, not under my act, taxation and levies on foods to reduce consumption. So Treasury said the sugar tax, but it's supposed to be called the health promotion tax, because the money from that tax is supposed to go to the Department of Health to do those health promotion activities that he was talking about. Educate our consumers. We called it the sweetened beverage tax when it was first. And then you also know, Minister of Finance always makes the Treasury announcement, the sin tax, increasing on alcohol products. Okay? Cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, mainly alcohol as well. I'm only talking about alcohol, because that could be regarded as a foodstuff. We actually regulate beer, but not the other alcohol products, because there's another piece of legislation covering them, but they're going to pull in that beer. And then there's been other countries that have adopted a fat tax. Not if you are overweight, not if you're obese. I know some airlines have tried to do that. In the US, 2 seats for the price of, one person and needing 2 seats. This is more for saturated fat. Saturated fat is a horrible thing in our diets. We eat too much saturated fat, and that leads to hyperlipidemia, obesity, cholesterol, hypertension. And so the proposal in this country, I think it's Britain, to put a tax on red meat. I don't want to deal with that one if it ever comes here. Please don't tell that to Treasury. So the other aspects of food security, you heard being mentioned the National Food and Nutrition Strategy or policy. First it was a policy, then it was a strategy, and now they're working on the implementation plan. It's a conglomeration of those 4 departments: Department of Basic Education, the Department of Social Development, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and the Department of Health. And I'm not sure if the Department of Land Affairs is also part of it, rural land and rural affairs. But each of them has their role to play in relation to ensuring food security. The Department of Basic Education has the Mandela program, school feeding, started in 1996 in primary schools. And I think since then it's evolved to even now be in secondary schools as well. Department of Social Development, the social assistance, grants, food parcels for indigents. Agriculture, responsible or mandated to ensure food security both nationally as well as household. But that's also the start of good food, and of course we heard it starts in the soil, eh? So that's where the start of good food happens, and us at Department of Health deals with nutrition, the end of the food, the outcomes. So we look at the indicators on how we can assess whether or not food security is actually good or in place. So the indicators around stunting, under 5, malnutrition rates, all of those kinds of things, growth monitoring, all of those things. In conclusion, I've said that the WHO has said that the best bang for our buck is nutrition interventions through legislation or regulatory frameworks. But, as has been mentioned already, people's behavior is not regulated, and thus social determinants, so what happens to you from a social perspective, and or the choices you make, determine whether food security and nutrition is being impacted on. The final thing is science is critical. And what I often find is that sometimes the research paper is out of there, we have a problem, and yet the departments with that mandate has not been told about the research. But the first recommendation is we're going to advise government to put in place regulatory frameworks or whatever the recommendation is. But at no stage has anyone even engaged the department, but it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. So research is important to us to regulate, then research again, is it making an impact, review, research again, science, revise, repeal, and so the cycle continues. And that is it from me. I'll leave you with that little bit of food for thought. In English, there's a saying called the pot calling the kettle black. Eh? He's sitting with all his unhealthy food and he's saying to the smoker, don't you think that's a bad thing to do? So to all of those who understand our 11 languages and the new one that will come in, and my last slide, if you need any of the information I've spoken about where you actually want to engage on the actual regulations, you go through the government process of getting lost on a website. And so I've given you step by step on how you find our legislation. You'll find our legislation, you'll find our guidelines, and you might even find contact details. I haven't checked it. But that's it from me, Chairperson. Thank you very much.